The throne has always been more than a seat of power. For some kings, it became a license to indulge in the darkest desires of the human soul. Behind the gilded doors of royal palaces, where courtiers bowed and subjects trembled, the crown gave certain rulers not just authority, but absolute immunity. In their hands, power was not a tool for justice, but a weapon for pleasure. Imagine a court filled with whispers. A servant dares not meet the king's eye, for he knows that refusal to obey could mean imprisonment or worse. A noblewoman averts her gaze, knowing that to catch the monarch's attention might condemn her to his bed. Guards patrol not merely to defend the realm, but to enforce the whims of a man who sees himself as godlike, accountable to no one. Throughout history, kings have been remembered as conquerors, builders, reformers, yet some earned their place in infamy for the corruption of their desires. These were rulers who blurred the lines between governance and indulgence, who treated their kingdoms as playgrounds and their subjects as possessions. Their perversions were not only private scandals but public threats, destabilizing nations and staining dynasties. This story is not about the glory of kingship, but about its corruption. It is about rulers who, under the protection of absolute power, allowed their darkest instincts to flourish unchecked. Some forced marriages upon children. Others created harems filled with unwilling captives. Still others delighted in cruelty, transforming their palaces into theaters of humiliation. But why did they act this way? And why were they allowed to continue? The answer lies in the nature of absolute monarchy itself. For centuries, the king was the law. His body was sacred, his word divine. To question him was treason, to oppose him was death. Surrounded by flatterers, insulated by privilege, and empowered by armies, these kings lived in a world where morality ceased to exist. In this series, we will uncover the perverted kings of history, exposing the hidden chambers of their palaces, the whispered rumors of their courts, and the brutal consequences of their reigns. We will see how lust and cruelty were not merely private vices, but political weapons that shaped empires. This is not a tale of romance or nobility. It is a tale of obsession, corruption, and the terrifying truth that when power is absolute, so too is the corruption it breeds. But welcome to the Perverted Kings, Secrets of Absolute Power. To understand how kings could transform their courts into dens of corruption, we must first understand the world that enabled them. Medieval and early modern monarchies were built on the principle of divine right, the belief that kings ruled because God himself had chosen them. This idea gave rulers not only political authority, but a spiritual shield. A king's word was law, his body sacred, his will unchallengeable. In such an environment, the seeds of abuse grew quickly. Unlike nobles, who answered to peers, or commoners, who were bound by law, kings were judged by no one but themselves. Their whims could be enforced with armies, their desires indulged by servants eager to please. When absolute authority is placed in human hands, unchecked by morality or law, it invites corruption. Some kings resisted this temptation, others surrendered completely. The royal court as a theater of power. A medieval or Renaissance court was not merely a household, it was a stage on which the monarch's power was constantly performed. Banquets, hunts, processions, and ceremonies displayed wealth and authority. Yet behind the pomp lay darker realities. The same halls that hosted diplomatic feasts also concealed whispered affairs, coerced liaisons, and brutal punishments for those who defied the king's desires. Royal palaces were vast, complex spaces. They contained chapels and throne rooms, but also secret chambers, hidden passages, and locked doors where only the king and his chosen attendants could enter. For some monarchs, these hidden spaces became playgrounds for indulgence. The psychology of absolute power. Historians often debate why certain rulers became so deeply corrupt. Was it madness? Was it the pressure of rule? Or was it simply the opportunity? Modern psychology suggests that absolute power diminishes empathy and increases impulsivity. Surrounded by flatterers, kings grew convinced of their own invincibility. Their subjects were not people but pieces on a chessboard, to be moved, exploited, or discarded. For kings with already unstable personalities, violent tempers, obsessions, or unrestrained desires, absolute power was the perfect fuel. What would be considered perversion in an ordinary man became custom in a monarch, because no one dared call it by its name. Case studies of corruption. The chronicles of history give us chilling examples. Emperor Nero of Rome, though not medieval, set the template centuries earlier. He indulged in forced relationships, humiliations, and even married a castrated boy in a grotesque parody of marriage. His reign taught later historians that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Ferdinand VII of Spain, centuries later, ruled in the early 19th century and earned notoriety for sexual obsessions that scandalized his court. His desperation for heirs, combined with his authoritarian personality, led him into acts that blurred the line between private vice and political failure. King Charles II of England, remembered fondly as the Merry Monarch, filled his court with mistresses, favoring them with lands and titles while ignoring governance. His indulgence might appear harmless compared to others, but it set a precedent for monarchy as theatre of pleasure rather than duty. King Louis XV of France, in the 18th century, constructed an elaborate network of mistresses, culminating in the infamous Parc-aux-Cerfs, a private residence where young women were kept for his enjoyment. Though cloaked in luxury, this system reduced women to possessions, their lives dictated by the whims of the king. Ottoman sultans, ruling an empire that stretched across continents, developed the institution of the imperial harem. Though sometimes romanticized, in reality many of the women were captives, their fates determined by the ruler's desires. Within those walls, politics and passion intertwined, and the sultan's appetites could alter the course of the empire. The silence of subjects. Why were such kings tolerated? Why did no one stop them? The answer lies in fear and complicity. Courtiers relied on royal favor for wealth and survival. Servants depended on the palace for their livelihoods. Nobles who challenged the king risked exile, imprisonment, or death. Even the church, which might have condemned excess, often chose silence in exchange for protection or privilege. This silence created an echo chamber in which kings could act without consequence. Their behavior was whispered about in taverns, chronicled cautiously by historians, but rarely confronted. In time, their reputations would be tarnished, but while alive, they ruled with unchecked freedom, a pattern across time though centuries and cultures separated them. The perverted kings shared common traits. They inherited or seized absolute power. They surrounded themselves with flatterers. They believed themselves untouchable, and they used their authority not for justice or governance, but for indulgence. Each story reveals a truth about monarchy itself. The system was designed not to restrain kings, but to exalt them. When virtue guided the throne, kingdoms prospered. When vice ruled, kingdoms suffered. Setting the stage for secrets, this is the world into which our tales of perverted kings unfold. These rulers were not anomalies, but products of a system that granted them divine authority without accountability. Their secrets festered in locked chambers, whispered in the corners of palaces, and echoed through history as cautionary tales. As we move forward, we will step inside those palaces. We will see the ceremonies and the shadows, the glory and the corruption. We will examine not only the deeds themselves, but the consequences they unleashed upon kingdoms, dynasties, and ordinary people. For the perversions of kings were never private. They shaped politics, altered succession, and sometimes even brought nations to ruin. And it is in these consequences that we find the true secrets of absolute power. Absolute power rarely reveals its corruption immediately. At first, scandals are whispered, dismissed as rumors, or tolerated as eccentricities of kingship. Yet beneath the glittering veneer of royal courts, the earliest signs of perversion often emerged in subtle but telling ways. These first scandals were warnings, and when ignored, they blossomed into tragedies that scarred kingdoms. The Roman shadow, Nero's example though, centuries separated them. Later monarchs could not escape the shadow of Nero, the infamous emperor of Rome. His scandalous marriage to the boy, Sporus castrated and paraded in bridal robes, was remembered as the ultimate perversion of power. For medieval chroniclers, Nero was a cautionary tale, proof that unchecked rulers could descend into grotesque indulgence. When whispers arose in European courts about kings who blurred the lines between governance and desire, comparisons to Nero were inevitable. Richard II and indulgence in England. Richard II himself, though not as infamous as later kings, was accused of excess and favoritism. Chroniclers noted his obsession with magnificence, extravagant clothes, jewels, and feasts. His intimacy with young favorites raised eyebrows among nobles who saw impropriety in his attentions. While not overtly perverted by later standards, these early suspicions eroded respect for his reign, fueling discontent that would eventually cost him his crown. The Ottoman harems in the Ottoman Empire. The earliest scandals revolved around the imperial harem. To outsiders, the harem was a realm of mystery, filled with women devoted to the sultan. In truth, many of those women were captives, taken from conquered lands, and forced into lives they had not chosen. When sultans allowed their desires to eclipse governance, the empire itself trembled. Murmurs of favoritism of entire political decisions, swayed by a concubine's influence, circulated throughout Istanbul. The first tragedies of the harem were not only private but political. Rivalries between women led to poisonings, assassinations, and succession crises. Behind the walls of Topkapi, lust and ambition mingled, shaping the future of an empire. Ferdinand VII, Spain's shame moving forward in time. Ferdinand VII of Spain epitomized how scandal could consume a monarch's reputation. Obsessed with producing heirs, he manipulated marriage, mistresses, and even coercion in pursuit of his desires. His perversions were whispered in salons, recorded in secret diaries, and condemned by later historians. In his lifetime, courtiers laughed nervously or remained silent, too fearful to speak openly. But his actions destabilized Spain, already fragile after the Napoleonic Wars. The French court, Louis XV's secrets in France. Louis XV's Parc-aux-Cerfs became a scandal, even in its earliest days. This private residence, hidden from the grandeur of Versailles, was stocked with young women brought for the king's pleasure. At first, it was justified as the privilege of monarchy after all. Mistresses were an accepted tradition, but whispers of coercion and the youth of some of the women spread unease. Even in a society accustomed to indulgence, Louis's excesses felt different, more systematic, more predatory. Tragedy in the making. The common thread in these early scandals was the silence surrounding them. Courtiers who knew the truth dared not speak. Chroniclers, dependent on royal patronage, softened their accounts. The church, too often, remained quiet, unwilling to risk confrontation with kings who could strip away lands and privileges. Yet silence did not erase consequences. In each kingdom, the king's indulgence bred resentment among nobles, disgust among commoners, and instability within the realm. What began as whispers of perversion festered into crises that shaped history. In England, suspicions of Richard II's favourites weakened his legitimacy, paving the way for rebellion. In the Ottoman Empire, rivalries within the harem sparked political assassinations that altered succession. In Spain, Ferdinand VII's obsessions discredited his monarchy, leaving Spain fractured and unstable. In France, Louis XV's scandals tarnished the crown, contributing to the climate of resentment that would explode in the French Revolution. The hidden victims. Perhaps the most tragic element of these early scandals was the fate of their victims. For every mistress granted wealth, dozens of women were discarded, forgotten, or ruined. For every noble who gained favor, countless servants and captives bore the burden of silence. The stories of these women rarely reached the chronicles. Their names were not recorded, their suffering unacknowledged. Yet their lives, stolen by the appetites of kings, were the truest measure of the corruption of absolute power. The lesson ignored. The first scandals of perverted kings were not isolated incidents. They were warnings that power without restraint invites corruption. But in age after age, society failed to act. Kings were tolerated, excused, even celebrated for their excesses. The cost was paid not by them, but by their subjects, their kingdoms, and the victims trapped within their palaces. And so, the tragedies multiplied. What began as rumors grew into crises. What began as indulgence ended in ruin. Absolute power is rarely satisfied with moderation. Once the boundaries of morality are breached, indulgence escalates. What began as whispers of scandal often swelled into entire cultures of corruption, where kings and emperors turned their thrones into instruments of desire. This journey into decadence did not merely shape their private lives, it bled into the governance of their realms, inflicting suffering on countless innocents. The Ottoman harems, gilded prisons. Few images capture royal decadence more vividly than the imperial harems of the Ottoman Empire. To the outside world, they were shrouded in mystery and exoticism, immortalized in European paintings as places of beauty and sensuality. But inside, reality was harsher. Many of the women who filled these harems were captives, seized from conquered lands or given as tribute. Torn from their homes, they entered a world where their bodies became bargaining chips in the politics of empire. The sultans indulged in luxury, surrounding themselves with silks, jewels, and endless attendants. Yet the harem was also a battlefield. Rivalries between concubines and their factions erupted into poisonings and assassinations. Entire wars of succession were decided not on the battlefield, but within the hidden chambers of Topkapi Palace. A sultan's lust could elevate one woman to unimaginable power, while condemning another to obscurity or death. For the women trapped there, life was a paradox of splendor and captivity. Their gilded surroundings could not erase the truth. They were prisoners, their fates bound to the desires of a single man. France, Louis XV, and the machinery of indulgence across Europe. The French monarchy built its own machinery of decadence. Louis XV inherited a kingdom renowned for the brilliance of Versailles. Yet beneath the glittering mirrors and fountains, his reign descended into scandal. The king's obsession with mistresses became institutionalized, culminating in the infamous Parc-aux-Cerfs. This hidden residence near Versailles housed a rotating array of young women, many coerced or misled into service. Officials arranged their recruitment, creating a system that resembled less a romance and more a bureaucracy of exploitation. While courtiers competed for favor through the king's mistresses, the people of France suffered crushing taxes and hunger. The contrast was glaring. Outside the palace, famine stalked villages. Inside, Louis XV dined on delicacies, entertained by a carousel of unwilling companions. His decadence symbolized the disconnect between crown and people. When the French Revolution erupted a generation later, the memory of such indulgence fanned the flames of resentment. Spain. Ferdinand VII's obsessions in Spain. Ferdinand VII took decadence to grotesque extremes. Obsessed with producing an heir, he forced his young wives and mistresses into humiliating rituals. His paranoia about impotence drove him into increasingly bizarre practices, whispered about with horror in Madrid. Court physicians, priests, and courtiers alike became unwilling accomplices in his quest, each too afraid to confront the king's excesses. While Spain reeled from political turmoil after the Napoleonic Wars, Ferdinand devoted himself less to governance and more to personal obsession. His court became a theater of humiliation, his wives and companions the unwilling actors. In the eyes of his people, the king's bedchamber became a metaphor for the degradation of the monarchy itself. England, Charles II and the Mary Court. Not every monarch's decadence was marked by cruelty, but indulgence still carried consequences. Charles II of England earned the nickname the Merry Monarch for his lively court. His reign was filled with music, plays, and mistresses, many of whom were rewarded with wealth and titles. For a time, this atmosphere seemed harmless, a welcome relief after the grim austerity of Oliver Cromwell's Puritan rule. But beneath the laughter lay instability. Charles's constant favoritism toward his mistresses and illegitimate children angered Parliament and fueled political divisions. His indulgence eroded respect for the crown, contributing to the growing tensions that would shape the monarchy for generations. The human cost in every case. The king's decadence came at a human cost. Behind the glamour of palaces were countless lives scarred, women taken from families, coerced into submission, or abandoned when their novelty faded. Courtiers manipulated, elevated one day, and ruined the next. Ordinary subjects, taxed into poverty, watched their rulers drown in luxury. For the victims, survival often meant silence. Chroniclers rarely recorded their names. Their stories were buried beneath the splendor of ceremonies and the rhetoric of divine right. Yet their suffering was the most tangible consequence of royal corruption. The kingdom suffers with the king. Decadence did not remain confined to private chambers. It seeped into politics. A sultan distracted by his harem neglected the affairs of state, leaving ministers to scheme unchecked. A French king obsessed with mistresses allowed corruption to flourish in government. A Spanish monarch consumed by obsession failed to stabilize his fractured nation. The pattern was clear. When kings indulged their desires above their duties, kingdoms faltered, armies went unpaid, treasuries emptied, rebellions festered. The very stability of nations was undermined by the unchecked appetites of a single man. The illusion of immortality, what drove such excess? Perhaps it was the illusion of immortality. Surrounded by splendor, worshipped by courtiers, kings believed themselves untouchable. They mistook obedience for admiration, silence for approval. They convinced themselves that history would forgive or forget, but history has a long memory. The decadence of kings became fuel for revolutions, justification for rebellions, and lessons for future generations. Their secrets, once hidden in locked chambers, spilled into the streets when their subjects could bear no more. the descent continues. As we trace the journey of these perverted kings, we see a consistent trajectory. What began as indulgence escalated into systems of corruption. What began as scandal grew into tragedy. Each step into decadence drew not only the ruler but the entire realm closer to collapse. The suffering of victims, the decay of politics, the ruin of kingdoms all flowed from the same source: absolute power without restraint. Decadence has a breaking point. For perverted kings, the indulgences that once remained whispers in palace corridors eventually swelled into scandals too large to conceal. The climax of corruption was not simply personal, it reverberated across nations, undermining monarchies and altering history. France, Louis XV's shame unveiled by the mid-18th century. The French people were well aware of Louis XV's indulgences, while Versailles dazzled foreign visitors. Ordinary Parisians whispered about the king's private estate, the Parc-aux-Cerfs where young women were kept for his pleasure. What had once been a secret became an open scandal. Satirical pamphlets circulated, depicting the king as a lecherous old man, more concerned with his mistresses than with the plight of his starving people. Louis's corruption reached a climax not because it was new, but because it became impossible to ignore. France was sinking into debt, harvests failed, and resentment boiled among the poor. The sight of the king squandering wealth on mistresses while peasants begged for bread crystallized into outrage. By the time Louis died, his reputation was ruined. The monarchy's moral authority was so corroded that within a generation, revolution swept France, toppling the very system that had protected him. Spain. Ferdinand VII's grotesque legacy in Spain. Ferdinand VII's private obsessions warped into grotesque rituals. His desperation for an heir led to humiliations inflicted upon his wives, whispered about with horror across Madrid. Diplomats recorded with disbelief the extent of the king's fiction, and foreign courts mocked Spain's monarch behind closed doors. But the true climax of his corruption lay not only in his sexual perversions, but in his governance. While Ferdinand indulged his obsessions, Spain's political system collapsed. He reversed liberal reforms, reinstated absolutism, and crushed opposition. The monarchy, already fragile after Napoleonic domination, became synonymous with tyranny and degradation. His corruption turned Spain into a land of unrest, rebellions, and decline, a nation adrift under a king consumed by self. The Ottoman Empire. Harem wars for the Ottoman sultans. The climax of corruption often came through the politics of the harem. As rival concubines fought for influence, entire dynasties trembled. In some reigns, brothers were strangled, heirs poisoned, and mothers wielded power from behind the curtains of the imperial chambers. One of the most infamous episodes came when a sultan's indulgence left governance to his favorites. While the empire's borders weakened, the harem, once intended as a symbol of dynastic continuity, became a stage for intrigue and bloodshed. The climax of corruption was measured not in gossip, but in the instability of an empire that stretched across continents. England, Charles II, and public disillusion, though less grotesque than his continental counterparts. Charles II's indulgence reached its climax in disillusion. The merry monarch filled his court with music, laughter, and mistresses, but in doing so, he eroded respect for the institution of monarchy. His illegitimate children were numerous, his favorites powerful, and his focus on pleasure often outweighed his attention to governance. By the later years of his reign, Parliament and the people viewed the monarchy as a theatre of indulgence rather than duty. The Restoration, once celebrated as a return to stability, became a symbol of weakness. The climax of his corruption was not scandal alone, but the way it hollowed out respect for the crown, paving the way for constitutional reforms that would permanently limit royal power. The people rise. The climax of corruption across kingdoms shared one unifying feature: the people noticed. In earlier centuries, whispers of scandal might remain confined to courts, but with the spread of pamphlets, newspapers, and growing literacy, royal perversions became public knowledge. What had been rumored turned into evidence. What had been tolerated became intolerable. The people saw their rulers not as divine, but as decadent. And when famine struck, when taxes rose, when wars drained the land, those perversions became the rallying cry of resistance. Revolution in France, unrest in Spain, rebellion in the Ottoman provinces, all were fueled, in part, by the corruption of rulers who had mistaken absolute power for absolute license. The irreversible stain for monarchies. Corruption's climax was not only a moment but a stain that history would not wash away. Louis XV would forever be remembered as the king who tarnished Versailles, Ferdinand VII as the monarch who humiliated Spain, Ottoman sultans as rulers whose harems symbolized captivity and intrigue, Charles II as the merry but unserious king who cheapened the crown. Each kingdom bore scars. Trust in monarchy eroded. Subjects turned to revolution, rebellion, or reform. The climax of corruption marked not just the fall of kings, but the fall of the systems that enabled them. The corruption of kings rarely ended with their deaths. The consequences of their indulgence stretched across generations, shaping dynasties, fueling revolutions, and staining the very idea of monarchy. What they saw as private pleasures became public burdens, leaving scars that their kingdoms carried long after they were gone. France, the poisoned seed of revolution. Louis XV's successes at Versailles planted seeds of resentment that blossomed in the French Revolution. While his grandson Louis XVI inherited the throne, he also inherited the tarnished image of monarchy as an institution of decadence. The people did not see a divine ruler chosen by God. They saw a lineage of men who gorged themselves on luxury while peasants starved. Pamphlets and rumors painted Louis XV as a predator, his Parc-aux-Cerfs the emblem of monarchy's corruption. This image did not die with him. It lingered, poisoning public opinion. By 1789, when Paris erupted, the memory of perverted kings provided moral justification for tearing down the monarchy altogether. Versailles, once the dazzling symbol of royal power, became a monument to arrogance and exploitation. Spain, a monarchy in ruins. The aftermath of Ferdinand VII's reign was equally devastating. His obsession with heirs and his personal corruption merged with his political absolutism to cripple Spain. He reversed constitutional reforms, alienated liberals, and left behind a contested succession that erupted into the Carlist Wars. The image of Ferdinand as a weak, grotesque monarch lingered in Spanish memory. Instead of healing after the Napoleonic Wars, Spain stumbled from crisis to crisis, its monarchy discredited, its people divided. His legacy was not one of continuity but of fracture. For Spain, Ferdinand embodied the dangers of monarchy unchecked, a king who cared more for his bedchamber than his people. The Ottoman Empire declined through decadence. The sultans who allowed their harems to dominate politics paid a heavy price. Succession crises weakened the empire. Assassinations within the palace destabilized governance, and distracted rulers allowed provincial revolts to spread, while military defeats and economic stagnation also played their part. The image of the Ottoman court as a place of corruption eroded both domestic loyalty and foreign respect. European observers seized upon these stories, painting the empire as decadent and effete. In diplomatic circles, the sick man of Europe label grew not only from military defeats, but also from tales of sultans who neglected statecraft for indulgence. The empire's eventual decline cannot be separated from the perception and reality of royal corruption. England, limits on monarchy in England. Charles II's reign of merriment and mistresses did not produce revolutions of blood, but it did accelerate constitutional change. Parliament, already wary of royal absolutism after the turmoil of the Civil War, grew increasingly determined to check the crown's authority. The indulgence of Charles reinforced the belief that kings could not be trusted with unchecked power. By the end of the 17th century, the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights firmly limited the monarchy. The consequences of Charles's reign were clear. The crown would survive, but only as a constitutional shell of its former self. His personal indulgence hastened the erosion of divine right monarchy in England, the victims forgotten across all these realms. The most immediate consequences were borne not by dynasties but by individuals, those who had been forced, coerced, or manipulated by kings. Their names rarely appear in history books. They were concubines, mistresses, servants, and wives whose suffering was hidden behind the splendor of palaces. The silence of history is itself a consequence. By erasing the victims, chronicles protected kings and preserved dynasties. Yet the scars remained, passed quietly through families, whispered in villages, fueling the distrust of monarchy that exploded when revolutions finally gave the people a voice. The pattern revealed when we examine the aftermath. A pattern becomes undeniable. The corruption of kings eroded the very foundations of monarchy. It weakened the crown's moral authority. It alienated subjects, who saw rulers as predators rather than protectors. It destabilized dynasties through contested successions and revolts. It fueled revolutions, rebellions, and reforms that redefined the balance of power. The aftermath of decadence was rarely immediate collapse, but it was always decline. Each perverted king chipped away at the mystique of monarchy, until crowns once seen as divine were dragged into the mud of human corruption. Lessons ignored. Lessons remembered. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is that these consequences were predictable. Chroniclers compared later kings to Nero, warning of history repeating itself. Philosophers cautioned that absolute power breeds corruption. Yet, generation after generation, monarchies ignored the warnings until collapse or reform forced change. The aftermath of their corruption lives on in history's verdict. Some, like Louis XV and Ferdinand VII, are remembered more for their vices than their achievements. Others, like Charles II, are recalled with a mix of amusement and criticism. The Ottoman sultans, once rulers of a mighty empire, are remembered through the lens of harem intrigues. For their kingdoms, the cost was immense. For history, the lesson is stark. When rulers surrender to decadence, nations pay the price. The stories of perverted kings are not mere scandals locked in the past. They are warnings, echoing across centuries, reminding us that unchecked power invites unchecked corruption. While some of these rulers are remembered for their victories or reforms, their legacies are overshadowed by the darker truths of their reigns. Harems built on captivity, courts consumed by indulgence, and kingdoms destabilized by obsession. Their victims remain the most haunting legacy. The women coerced into service, the courtiers destroyed by favoritism, the subjects crushed by taxes to fund palaces of pleasure. These lives are rarely named in chronicles, yet they represent the real cost of monarchy's perversions. When kings treated people as possessions, they destroyed not only individuals but also the trust that bound ruler and subject. History's verdict is clear. Louis XV of France, Ferdinand VII of Spain, the Ottoman sultans, and Charles II of England all suffered reputational ruin. Their excesses fed revolutions, rebellions, and reforms that stripped monarchs of their absolute authority. What they believed to be divine right was revealed as human weakness. Today, their stories continue to fascinate, not because of their lurid details, but because of the lesson they embody. The grandeur of palaces and the splendor of crowns cannot conceal the truth. When rulers place their desires above their duties, nations collapse. Absolute power does not merely corrupt, it corrodes everything it touches. The legacy of perverted kings is therefore not one of triumph but of caution. They stand as eternal reminders that power without accountability leads not to glory, but to ruin. This is the true secret of absolute power, its ability to destroy both kings and kingdoms alike.